My topic today is going to talk about nurses, doughboys, and engineers. A little bit of a different subtitle here, Convoying in the World Wars. On April 27, 1917, the SS Lorraine arrived in Hampton Roads, bringing former French Prime Minister René Vivani for an initial meeting with Admiral Henry T. Mayo, and eventually meetings with the Secretary of the Navy, the new Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral William S. Benson, and with President Woodrow Wilson. This is just 3 weeks after the U.S. declared war. Shortly thereafter, the RMS Olympic comes in, bringing Arthur Balfour, another former Prime Minister, this time from the UK. They're both meeting to set up initial plans for U.S. entry into the First World War and how they could coordinate efforts between the two sides. Admiral William S. Sims has already sailed across on board SS New York. He's meeting with Admiral Jellicoe and the Admiralty to coordinate on the Atlantic side. Out of that meeting comes a couple of decisions with Vivani and Balfour. First is that we're going to establish cruiser squadrons in both the North Atlantic and South Atlantic to hunt down German raiders. The U.S. Pacific Fleet under Admiral Fulham will go through the Panama Canal, bring its 4 armored cruisers, and begin patrolling off the South Atlantic coast, while 4 armored cruisers will take up that role on the North Atlantic station. One of the things that Balfour brings with him is a request from the Royal Navy for U.S. destroyers, in which case Admiral Mayo gladly offers 1. He subsequently changes that offer to include it to 2. That's going to change, as we'll see. But the issue I want to talk about specifically here deals with convoying. And I'm not going to talk about the issue over whether to convoy or not. Nick Jellicoe just came out with a great book that kind of deals with this in a lot of detail. What I want to focus on here is the issue about how to convoy, and more importantly, the lessons that were learned by the United States that we don't tend to look at going into World War II, and how the convoying experience from World War I impacts the U.S. Navy. We look at Jutland a lot. Man, everybody's fighting Jutland again on the floors of the Naval War College, but we're not really looking at convoying. So one of the members that comes across with Vivani is this man. This is Marshal Joseph Joffre. And Joffre, the victor of the Marne, the first battle of the Marne, had subsequently been relieved in 1916, and he is part of the delegation come across. And there's a very famous statement by General Joffre: "We want men, men, and men." And I don't think you can read a World War I book where that statement isn't included in it. However, the full statement is a little bit more interesting because we don't tend to look at the full statement. Not alone for actual fighting, but for work of all kinds. It is natural that the ranks of the labor in France should have suffered depletion in these 3 years. We need men to work on roads, men to build and repair railroads, men for the telegraph and telephone, men for lumbering, every sort of capable labor. Not all of it necessarily military or militarized, but contributing as truly and honorably to winning the war as the fighting itself. What we're going to see is a movement over initially that's going to provide doctors, it's going to provide engineers, and it's going to provide the first of 43 U.S. infantry divisions that will go across. When you read General Pershing's report, one of the things he mentions right off the bat is the necessary need to move the first infantry, or excuse me, the first expeditionary division, that's what it was referred to at the time, over, along with 9 regiments of engineers. However, it's during a reception in Washington, D.C., that Dr. Franklin Martin, who is actually the founder of the American College of Surgeons, is on a receiving line when he meets Arthur Balfour. Balfour says to Dr. Martin, "Are you a doctor?" And he replied, "Yes, I am." They introduced each other, and immediately Balfour made the request, "Can you send us doctors? We are in desperate need of doctors." Martin asked how many. He said, "We need 1,000. Martin said, "We'll send 2,000. And so one of the things that they're going to focus on here almost initially is sending over medical units. Dr. George Creel, who had set up the Ambulance Americaine for the French Army, who's also the creator of the blood transfusion, had previously, under the preparedness movement, set up an American hospital that could go over to France. That became the basis for what becomes U.S. Army base hospitals, 250-person base hospitals formed under existing hospitals around the United States. For example, Creel is out of Cleveland, Ohio, so he bases it on the hospital in Cleveland. And these 500-bed hospitals are going to be sent over as the first element of the American Expeditionary Force that's going to be sent over. 6 of them specifically are going to head across. Now, the image that comes to mind when you talk about World War I and the U.S. Navy has to be this. This is the return of the Mayflower. This is the 1st Destroyer Division. This is Joe Taussig's division coming across Destroyer Division 8 in Queenstown. April of 1917, bad month for the Allies. If you're on the poly market and you're betting on World War I, you're probably betting on the Central Powers in April of 1917. The French Army has mutiny, has initiated a mutiny, those instances of collective indiscipline. The Italian Army has suffered a setback at Caporetto. The Russian military has had 1 revolution and it's getting ready for the 2nd revolution. And the Germans decide to initiate unrestricted submarine warfare part 2. And their focus is going to be to hit the British in 1917 so that when it rolls into 1918, they can win the war on land. He is to sink more than 600,000 tons of shipping heading to Europe. In April of 1918, they not only do that, they sink an extra 200,000 tons on top of that. They're being extremely successful in their operations. At this point, the U.S. and the Royal Navy have had discussions both back in the United States and with Sims and Jellicoe, and they agree to ship over 36 destroyers out of a total of 66 destroyers across to set up a flotilla out of Queenstown, which is today Cobh in southern Ireland. It is initially going to be used for patrolling methods. They're going to go out and basically go look for a needle in a haystack. That's what they're doing. They're going out and looking for German subs. The armament on the submarines to deal with anti-submarine warfare, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is pretty minimal. Basically, it's the Mark I eyeball, and all the ships are fitted with depth charges, 2, because that's all they have. They're given 2 depth charges. Later on, they increase it to 4, but 2 is what they have to go out with. And so this is going to be a bit hit and miss. Eventually, they're going to shift over to convoys, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Initially, the base hospitals come across in single ship convoys. I want to highlight this dynamite man right here, who is absolutely decked out in all his glory. There has not been a Navy lieutenant more swashbuckling, in my opinion, since Stephen Decatur sailed the Intrepid into Tripoli Harbor to burn the Philadelphia. That is Lieutenant Waldo E. Walston. It's a great name. He is part of the Armed Guard Detachment on board SS Mongolia. SS Mongolia is one of the ships that's going to bring over those base hospitals. And this ship suffers a very unique aspect in that it, along with 4 other ships, will bring over 6 base hospitals. One ship will double load 2 base hospitals. And they come across. Now, these ships are not convoyed across. They are sent across singly, and they are met up by destroyers from Queenstown, and they are escorted in, because right now the German U-boat offensive that's taking place is solely on the western approaches, basically the region just southwest of Ireland. And so the U.S. will send out destroyers to meet them. But this is also where we see the first casualties for the American Expeditionary Force happens. It's on board Mongolia that during a gun shoot, training evolution is shortly after they left Hoboken, New Jersey, where they loaded, they had an accident. The aft 6-inch gun will be firing, and it'll actually hit a wave close aboard. The crew of the base hospital had come up on deck to watch the gunfire shoot, and when the shell hit the wave, shrapnel will spray back toward the ship. These 2 nurses right here, Edith Ayres and Helen Bennett Woods, become the first casualties of the American Expeditionary Force. They're sitting in actually chairs on the deck, and they will die. One other nurse is wounded. The ship has to turn around, return back to New York to offload them and to make subsequent repairs to the ship from the accident. However, the other base hospitals will come over, and it is haphazard. It is not done in any sort of organized manner. Matter of fact, when USS Wadsworth meets Orduna, bringing the very first base hospital over, there was no set rendezvous. They eventually found them, and then there was a bit of a communication because the ships could not tell who each other was. And fortunately, the captain on Wadsworth, Taussig, knew one of the people on board in the base hospital. So they were able to build up that communication. And what we see here is the development of eventually a system of convoys. The British want to adopt convoying. Now, convoying is not new. We've seen convoying throughout World War I. Early in World War I, we saw the convoying of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. We saw the convoying of the Australian Expeditionary Force and multiple convoys for the 6 or 7 Indian Expeditionary Forces that come across. Add to it, we saw convoys interacted a little bit earlier with the French coal trade, with the Dutch trade, and with the Norwegian trade. So a lot of talk about when convoys started. Convoys had been around for a while. But in May of 1917, the British are going to initiate convoys. The very first convoy will come out of Gibraltar, HG-1, and extremely successful. The convoy comes up, no losses incurred. But then they do one from the east coast of the United States, from Hampton Roads, which is known as HH-1, the first of the HH series. The British Admiralty sends word over to the United States, we want to sail this convoy across, you're sending destroyers across, why not marry one of those destroyer divisions up with the convoy, specifically Destroyer Division 5, the fourth of the squadrons or the divisions coming across. Admiral Benson refuses. He does not want to tie American destroyers to transoceanic convoys. Instead, HH-1 will sail across. It's escorted by a British armored cruiser, the Roxburgh, and it will meet up with 8 destroyers of the British 4th Flotilla out of Devonport. And that is because Admiral Benson believes that the idea for convoying is flawed by the British. The British want to set up big ship convoys. The HH-1 is a 12-ship convoy. By June, they're sending convoys over weekly, and those convoys grow from 12 to about 20 ships. Benson believes that's a mistake. We need to send smaller convoys, 4 ships maybe, tops, across. And so what we get into is these different ways to bring ships across. So you've got the base hospitals coming across on single ships, and then you have the deployment of the 1st Division. Now, these are the Doughboys coming across. Admiral Benson, through Admiral Mayo, who's the Atlantic Fleet commander, decides to designate his former commander of destroyers, Admiral Albert Gleaves, the role of commander of convoy. And so Gleaves is going to set up a convoy, and this is where we get this bipolar relationship across the Atlantic, where in the Admiralty's office, Admiral Duff is setting up the British Admiralty's office for convoying, and then you have Admiral Gleaves setting it up for the Americans. It's at this point, too, by the way, that Admiral Sims, who's been across now for about a month, gets the opportunity to go to Queenstown, and he's going to relieve Admiral Bale, the British Vice Admiral in charge of Queenstown, for a brief period of time. So Sims gets his one kind of operational command here for a brief period of time. And it's while he's there in Queenstown that he learns that the 1st Expeditionary Division is coming across in 4 different groups. And Admiral Gleaves decides to send them kind of in a mass. He sends the first 3 groups together out in small groups. So these are about 4 ships apiece with an escort of an armored cruiser or a protected cruiser, several destroyers, and they're going to come across. Sims is ordered to cut loose one of his destroyer divisions for each of those groups. He's got, at this time, 28 destroyers now over in Queenstown, and he's got to cut loose 6 destroyers every time one of these 4 groups come over. So at one point, he's going to be short 24 destroyers. He's just going to have 4 destroyers left at Queenstown. At the same time, he's got to patrol the western approaches. At the same time, he gets an order from Admiral Jellicoe, hey, I need you to peel off 11 destroyers to form escorts for an upcoming new series of convoys, the HS convoys. These are the convoys coming up from Sierra Leone, and later on another series of convoys, which are going to be the HN convoys. These are the New York convoys coming across. And Sims is apoplectic about this. He's like, Washington doesn't understand what's going on here. They're sending convoys across. They're not coordinating. We need to be coordinating. And this is where you get a very kind of interesting communication between Sims and Benson and Daniels about convoying. They just they're not on the same wavelength. And it eventually is going to lead to a problem. And it comes to an issue about where the question of priority is. To Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy, and Admiral Benson, it appears Sims is more concerned about cargo convoys. Sims is concerned about troop convoys. He just thinks that the way Gleaves is sending these convoys over is wrong. Number one, they should come in mass, and you shouldn't send little ones right on back of each other because you got to keep peeling destroyers off. He's got a minimal force. Even of the 28 destroyers he has, 4 of them are out of service because of issues with repairs and overhaul. And so he is continually facing problems with how to properly allocate his resources. And what we wind up with is this kind of division for a brief period of time. You get Daniels and Benson there who are making this argument about we need to send these smaller convoys over or actually send single ships over, versus Sims and Jellicoe, who have this other. And in the midst of this, as the troop convoys come in and they eventually meet, and there's a whole disagreement that happens, there's a series of destroyers that come across with the convoy, 7 of them. Gleaves wants to keep them in St. Nazaire to escort them out. Sims had given an order to Gleaves about sending them up to Queenstown, and so there's a brief period of time where there's no escorts to take the ships out. But the big thing is, in the midst of this, as this convoy is offloading and getting prepared to send back out, the U.S. sends out more ships. They load up several more base hospitals, and then they start loading up engineering regiments. And these engineering regiments are huge. These are 1,250-person regiments. They're big. And they start putting them on single ships, sending them across. And several of these vessels will arrive over in Europe without any notice whatsoever. In other words, they don't even get an escort coming in. They just arrive. And Sims sends a very heated note over to Benson and Daniels about this. It's like, you can't do this. This is a problem. We need to get this under control, because if we lose one of these ships, we're going to lose a massive number of troops. And this is where Benson will send a notice over that gets later on after the war. There's a huge naval investigation that takes place in 1921 over a letter that Sims writes. Within the investigation, one of the heated topics is a message from Benson that basically says single ships can sail by themselves. And what he's referring to is not the troop convoys, but he's talking about these single ships that are going. These single ships that are going across have armed guards, like you saw in Mongolia. They're high speed, 12 to 15 knots. And so far, they have not run afoul of U-boats at this time. What Sims is warning about is they will. It's only a matter of time till we have one of these accidents. And we need to get it under control. Ironically, it's Jellicoe and the Admiralty that kind of fix this. They have the later ships bringing over the later engineer regiments. 3 of them sail with the regiments without escort, but eventually they have the ships sail to Halifax, and these become the precursors for what is known as the HX convoy. The other element here is how Sims and the Queenstown destroyers deal with the anti-submarine aspect. I'm not going to get too much into this because of the other paper that's on here. I just want to make a note of one very interesting thing, is the tactics developed by the Queenstown destroyer flotilla are really unique. One of the things that happens is, because of the shortage of destroyers, this is the 2 depth charges on the stern of these ships, one of the things that Sims will do, and he pushes it over to Benson, is we need more depth charges produced. And one of the things I think that we fail to remember in World War II, if you talk about World War II and you talk about the Bureau of Ordnance in World War II, someone's going to bring a torpedo and the failure with it. You have to remember that the Bureau of Ordnance success came from World War I. They were amazingly successful in World War I. They produced 2 things in huge numbers: mines and depth charges. We go from having 2 depth charges on a destroyer to having 50. And those 50 allow us to do what's called the depth charge barrage. Remember, no sonar, no Aztec, no radar. The only defense you have for a convoy is 8 destroyers wrapped around it. And the strategy that is developed by the Americans is that when the attack takes place against a convoy, remember, it's not Wolfpack tactics, these are single U-boat attacks. You peel off 2 destroyers, you go to the point where the last saw the submarine, and you start laying a concentric circle of depth charges. You just start rolling them off on set times, and you lay this barrage. You will dump literally half the depth charges from each of the destroyers. And the goal here isn't to sink the subs, it's to push them down. It's to keep them under the water so the convoy can get away. And that is the key thing. The other aspect here is Sims gets really upset over what he perceives to be a misinterpretation of the German U-boat threat. In the United States, there was a fear at the beginning of the war that German U-boats would appear off our coast, for good reason. You have the Deutschland that sails into Baltimore in 1916, July of 1916. You have Han Rose in U-53 that pops their hatch and sails into Newport. He's in there for 4 hours, says hello, and then leaves. And then the next day sinks 5 ships off Narragansett Light. And one of the things that Sims sent right from the beginning, once he arrived in across, was that, listen, they're going to try to distract you. The Germans are going to try to distract you. Don't fall for it. If they send any U-boats off the U.S. coast, it is to distract us. And they don't initially. It's not until the summer of 1918 that they arrive. And when they do arrive, it happens exactly as Sims says. His reinforcement destroyers, the new Wicks-class destroyers that are now coming off the line, are held back. And not only are they held back, but the U.S. initiates a convoying system, not just along the east coast of the United States, but all the way down into the Gulf of Mexico. And I think all of those play a role in World War II. We don't talk about this enough in World War II. And one of the things that it's amazing to me, and I've done a separate paper on this, is the impact of the U-boat offensive against the United States, especially off the East Coast, early in 1942, and the Japanese I-boat offensive off the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington in December of 41 and January of 42. Just absolutely, memorialized by Steven Spielberg's 1941. These attacks do a couple of things. Number one, in the Pacific, prior to our entry in the Pacific, we've already started using some of the tactics from World War I. If you look at the reinforcement of the Philippines that starts in the summer of 1941, we are sending ships across the Pacific with cruisers as escort, something we learned from World War II. Send those cruisers across to defend them against armed cruisers, against potential threats. We're doing that because of the Japanese attack on the west coast of the United States, which is minuscule, I will admit. It causes panic, so much so that we are literally convoying ships from the west coast of the United States out to Pearl and down to Australia until the spring of 1943. And most people don't think we do it, but we're committing assets to it. On the East Coast, when we have the attack off the East Coast with Operation Drumbeat, one of the things that has to be thought about is, listen, Sims warned us in 1917, don't buy the attack. This is not the attack we should be worrying about. This is an offhand attack. They're trying to distract us. Our focus has to be on the Lend-Lease convoys going across. If you look at German U-boat sinkings in 1941, they're in the western approaches, they're in the mid-Atlantic area, they're not off the east coast of Canada and the United States. And so Admiral King, who comes in as Comminch, later on as CNO, decides to allocate his resources to the transoceanic convoys. And even when the German U-boats do make an appearance off the coast, he's got to look there and say, okay, we don't have enough escorts to escort them because, again, the Germans have changed tactics. They're using wolf pack tactics. And an unescorted convoy caught by a wolf pack is a disaster waiting to happen. What he does not know is that the Germans are not using wolf pack tactics off the East Coast. They're coming singularly off, in which case a modicum of escorts, what minimal escorts he has, could have changed the rules. And therefore, one of the things I think that's really interesting is why does the U.S. Navy not look at the convoying operations that took place in World War I? They take some lessons from them, and then ironically, one of the things they do is take some inaccurate lessons. One of the things that the Germans understand is that they're going to go to any spot where there's a avoidance of escorts. German U-boats are like cracks in the sidewalk. They're going to find that it's like water. They're going to find that crack in the sidewalk. And what eventually happens is the U.S. has got to extend out its convoy system, much like we did in the summer of 1918 when we established convoys off the east coast of the United States, in the Gulf of Mexico or America, whichever way you politically lean, and then into the Caribbean. And I think the lessons from World War I have a lot of implications for how we do convoying and anti-submarine operations in World War II. Thank you.